I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. I'm going to begin here today with a smaller flat-headed brush. This one is about 1/4 inch, and I've made sure that it's nice and damp so that all of the bristles stick together and I don't have any strays. This will make for a much more consistent stroke. I'm going to begin by taking some Cerulean blue, a little bit of Mars Black. We don't want too much just because Mars Black is a very strong pigment. I'll also grab a hint of my turquoise green, not much, and also a hint of our titanium white. Then we'll end up with this nice darker bluish green, and we'll start working right here on the inside of our wave. This is a great place to start and practice because it's relatively similar throughout. You're getting the base motions of the wave going. And as you can see, I have some darker drawings in here. I'm going to avoid those because those are areas I want slightly darker pigments. You can see that I'm making a myriad of strokes initially, and this is really just to ensure that I get a consistent movement. Sometimes if you go for one larger stroke like that, you can start to dip inwards too early, you can go a little bit wide, and you just get a much more consistent shape if you work through multiple little strokes. But this is the underside of the wave, and it's going to be quite dark because the light is going to have an issue working through all of this top portion. So we're just beginning with something nice and dark for our base layer. I'm going to mix up more of that pigment. Remember, we need significantly more cerulean blue. Then we do turquoise green. There we go. And I'm going to apply these layers a couple of times because we are working with a damp brush. It's very useful for rendering sharp lines and for keeping pigment wet longer, but it also creates semi-transparent layers, and I don't really want the base layer to be semi-transparent. So I'm starting here by creating a couple of thicker applications and just building a base for us to work on. There we have a good foundation. Now we will make our mixture a little bit darker. Grab some extra Mars Black, work that in. That's all we're going to do to this. Then I'll head back into that wave in the open areas, and we'll just fill in these movements. This will make it look like we have a shadowy area of our wave, and the green that we applied, or the bluish green initially, is more of the highlight. So these are the areas that really aren't receiving light. So now as we move in to work on some details, I'm switching to this smaller rounded pointed brush. This one is about 1/8 inch, and I'm going to begin by making sure that it too is nice and damp. Then we're going to create a highlighted pigment of that. So I'll start with some titanium white. I'll grab a little bit of cerulean blue. This time though, I'm going to grab about an equal mixture of my turquoise green. And I'll also use the smallest hint of a Mars Black, but we don't want much at all. Now this is going to be the pigment we use for all of the protruding portions of water, the areas that are going to catch reflective light from the water down here, because the light is reflecting down. A lot of this is going to be quite dark because the light can't make its way through, but portions down here are going to receive light. It's going to bounce around, and that's going to bounce back up here. It's important to note not only what you're painting, but why you're painting it. That way you know how to change it when the scenario changes. So with that, I'm just picking this one area I see on my reference photo. I'm making these pretty dominant highlights. And now I'll also work my way up here as well. And you can see that I'm making very small little strokes. I connected all of these. I'm not going to connect all of these, but I'm essentially following the movements of the wave. It's moving up this way, and I'm moving up that way here with my brush. Here you can see that my pigment is starting to run out as we get closer to the bottom. That's what we want. We want it to be a bit more opaque and reflective up here, and then that light dissipates as we move towards the bottom. So we have a series of taps for the right hand side right here, and we have a series of taps that connect for the left hand side. And as I almost fully run out of pigment, I'll start working it back up. That way you have this almost unnoticeable little texture and movement that'll make it all feel very cohesive. There we go. Like that a lot. I'm going to make sure my brush is still damp. Then we'll grab a bit more of that highlight, and I'll continue moving my way through the wave. If you add a lot of water to your brush, you may find that the pigment really thins to the point where you don't see that highlight against the dark background, because acrylics are semi-transparent, but in that case you just need to add more paint to your brush and outweigh the water. But the water is still extremely useful in these scenarios. Now I'm going to do a little bit of a blend backwards through these highlights, because it's going to move up the wave and it's going to dissipate into this middle section that's darker, which we painted with more Mars Black previously. I'm also going to make a couple of very loose strokes like that down here, because it's a little bit farther away. You won't see that same level of detail that you do right here, but we still want that movement happening. Going to grab some extra turquoise green, cerulean blue, titanium white, mix up more what we've been working with here. It's really quite nice. There we go. And we'll just accentuate a couple of the applications that may have been a little bit too thin because of our water. I'm also going to start working in here, pick some areas that I feel like could be highlighted. So we'll say there's going to be some movement there. We'll have some more movement there. And then once you have those highlighted areas, I'm just going to pick one edge, typically the one that moves up, and with a myriad of strokes, I'll have it blend into that darker pigment. Just like that. Now we're going to move up to the next portion of our wave here, and generally when you're working on a very complex wave, I definitely recommend breaking it up into little segments like this, another one here, rather than tackling it all at once, because it can really feel quite daunting that way. So we're just going to take it slow, break it down, and make it easy. Now I'm going to take, again, about an equal mixture of cerulean blue and turquoise green, a little bit of titanium white, not too much, and quite a bit of Mars Black. Mixing that over my previous darker mixture, that way I know that we are mixing something quite similar. Make this one a little bit brighter though. Maybe a little bit more green. Then I'll head up to the top, test it, and if you look at that in comparison to the last pigment, it actually is a little bit darker, and that's not what I want. So we're not going to continue using that. We're going to start making a new mixture right down below, starting with all of the other pigments, excluding Mars Black, and then I'll just slowly mix that with our last attempt. There we have something in between. We'll give this a shot. That's much better. So I'll just start working this right around our wave. I'm making all of my strokes in the same movement so that the wave will be moving. So it's changing slightly each time. And then as we get to the bottom of the wave, it's going to get significantly brighter because the wave is getting more thin and more light can pass through it. So I'll get some extra titanium white, a little bit of extra green, and we'll work that in. There we go. So far so good. Now we have a nice little base to work with. And I'll also grab a bit more of that darker pigment from before and work that into the back here where it is going to be a bit more thick. But I'm not going to go too far because, again, I do want to break this up into a number of segments. Now, we have our base layer. We'll work back into some detail. Grab that smaller round-headed brush. I want a highlight similar to what we used before. So I'll mix that right here, right beside. That way I can monitor and make sure it is nice and close, if not a little bit brighter. And maybe a little bit more green. Tend to make the highlights slightly more green and the darker hues a little bit more blue. So now I'm going to look at how these are all moving. They're moving like this. These ones start to move up though because the wave is going to break a little bit right here. So I'll start working these in this direction. That way we can work up to a splash. And then eventually it'll go back to more of that initial motion that we were working with. And remember, in this scenario, there are a lot of blends. See that? It's going to look a little bit messy, but it won't in the end. This is just part of the process. Build up some highlights, make sure that these hues connect well. Leave the darker areas in between the highlights to show shadow. And it's really starting to come along. Grab a bit more. Paint a little bit more of that splashing effect. That will really accentuate in a couple of minutes, but right now we're moving it up in that direction. We're also going to have a little bit of water falling over this in a little bit, so this area is going to get quite complicated in a minute. We don't have to worry about it too much right now. Right now it's just taps moving out in this arc. There we go. Taking a step back, making sure that everything's moving the way I want it to, and we aren't kind of getting ahead of ourselves. So far so good. So I'll continue building up some of these highlights. I'm going back to this area a couple of times because we were working on a wet pigment, and that meant all of our highlights were blending with that darker pigment. So if you want anything truly bright, you will have to go back and do this a couple of times. There's nothing wrong with that. Every time you do it, you'll just add a little bit more detail, you'll get a little bit better at the application, and that's a great thing. Starting to run out of pigment, we'll mix a bit more. Talk about this in every lesson, but I generally don't like mixing a lot of pigment in the beginning, just because I like to test my color, make sure it's really what I want, and I also like to mix it a couple of times, because every time you mix it, you get better at mixing it, you remember how to mix it, so the next time you want this, say you're painting another seascape in a month from now, you know how to mix that color You've done it a couple times, you're well practiced, you probably remember it. And that can be extremely useful. I'm connecting a couple of these highlights together to create something a bit more structural and bold. So if you feel like you have all of these loose little strokes that move out in these directions, and you need something to connect them, just add more in between until they do connect, like this. There we go. Now, before we proceed with the splashing effects here and on the top of here, I really want to fill in the back of this wave. So I'm moving back to the smaller flat-headed brush, making sure that it's nice and damp. And the general idea right back here is that the top of it is going to be a little bit brighter and the bottom of it is going to be a little bit darker because of the light. It's coming down. It's going to give this a little bit of a reflection. As you move down here, we get a bit more of a shadow, so we're building some depth and dimension. With that, I am going to work with similar pigments to these. We already have them incorporated in the piece. They will feel cohesive and they are tested. So, just going to work on top of those initial mixtures, make sure that we have something that works quite well. I like that. I think it could use a little bit more blue. Give that a try. And remember, this is just the base layer, so it can be a bit more messy. All that we need is for it to be the right color, the right value, relatively thick, and the brush strokes are moving in that right direction of the wave. Now I'll mix up my darker pigment, Mars Black, Cerulean Blue, Turquoise Green, more Cerulean Blue though. Remember, shadows lean blue, highlights lean green. There we go, that's really nice. And this will come down, meet that. It'll come up to here. We'll fill in all of those little white spots. You really don't want to leave any white showing from the canvas. If there's anything that's going to make the painting look not professional, it's going to be that. So just make sure you fill it in. Even if the value isn't perfect for that area, you can always go back and change it. So here I'm working those pigments back and forth. I'm taking the dark, moving it up into the light, taking the light, moving it down into the dark, and I'm really just going back and forth. That way it looks like we have little areas of shadow and little areas of highlight. And I'm also making just so many small strokes here. That way it looks like the water's a little bit choppy. And this larger wave is comprised of just a litany of smaller waves. So, there we have our base layer. And now we have two options. We can let it dry and then go back in and add our highlights, or we can add our highlights now. If we add them now, it'll mix, so you get a bit more of a smoother blend, but you'll have to apply more pigment and more layers because obviously it'll blend with the darker pigment. Where if we let it dry first and we go in, we can get a more natural pigment to what we have here on our palette because it won't directly be blending, but it will be a little bit off because acrylics are semi-transparent. You will see these darker pigments through it. You will still have to do a couple of layers. It's just not as many, but you won't get as smooth of an application. So it's really up to you. Maybe try both, see what you like. I'm going to jump in while it's still wet, but by the time I finish, it'll probably be dry and you'll see both techniques. With that said, let's get a little bit closer and do just that. So because we're now working back into smaller, sharper details, I am switching back to the smaller, pointed, round-headed brush. I'm going to make sure that it is nice and damp, and now we can create both a mixture of highlights and shadows. So we'll start with the highlights because I think they're just a little bit more fun. Titanium white, our turquoise green, cerulean blue, but less of it. There we go. Recognize that this pigment isn't going to be as bright on there because we are blending to a point. And I'm going to find some areas that I want to be the tops of these waves. And this is going to happen relatively naturally because when I was working back and forth with the flat-headed brush, I created all of these strokes and I mixed in areas that were lighter, ones that were darker. That all happened when we were taking the highlights, moving them down here, taking the shadows, moving them up here. And as a result, you had areas that are a little bit darker like that. So I'm going right under it. I'm adding the slight highlight, and then I might do a little bit of a blend downwards. But I'm keeping that top edge nice and sharp. Grab a bit more. Let's say, okay, you know what? We have a shadow right here, so we'll go to the bottom of it. I'll add a slight highlight, and then I'll do a little bit of a blend. You can also make them up. You want to make sure that these are all different shapes and sizes, different opacities. You really want inconsistency here. And then as I move into this, I'm giving it a little bit of a slant, and then it moves back into the rolling motion of the general wave. Most of that was done there while it was wet, but it is now just about dry, so that's how the technique works, wet on to wet. Now we'll watch wet on to dry. And you can also take lots of these existing pieces and blend them together like that. This will make slightly larger waves and patches of water. So if you feel like it's getting a little too visually complicated, just start combining things. I'm also looking at the reference photo a lot just so I don't get off track. Can also test my colors up on it, make sure that they're what they need to be. So far so good. But if you do find matching colors and mixing colors is relatively difficult, I do recommend just printing out that reference photo, painting right on top of it, making sure your colors are correct before you apply them to the canvas, and then go for it. If they're not correct, then you know, edit the mixture on your palette, try it again on the reference photo, and just kind of go back and forth. That's what I do when I'm not entirely sure about a color. I actually did that before the painting started. I just tested a couple of them, made sure I was on the right track, and now here we are, and I can kind of mix my colors much more confidently. But here you can see I'm really starting to combine a lot of these. And these are the details I think a lot of us don't really think of initially. We think, we're painting a wave, a single wave. So, we'll do the big arch, we'll do the gradient, but it's comprised of just so many smaller ones. And when you add this detail, it really, really makes it special. There we go. Now, if you've added too much highlight or you simply want a little bit more shadow, you can always take a bit more Mars Black, Cerulean Blue, a hint of our green, a hint of our titanium white, mix that up, and you can either clean things up or just make some darker areas. So here I'm going to the top of our bright strokes, and I'm creating another sharp stroke, this time with the dark pigment, and then I'll blend up with this. So it's the opposite of what we did with the highlight. It's making it a bit more dramatic looking. I like that a lot. Then I'm just tapping that in here in a couple of areas, making sure that it's nice and cohesive, and that the wave fits together. It's all a single unit despite the fact that we painted it in a couple of different steps. Now we're going to start working inside of our wave yet again. I'm going to be using that same flat-headed brush, and we'll make sure that it's nice and damp. Now, this area right here is quite interesting because this white spot or plain spot on the canvas is actually going to be splashing water that's working its way down. So we're going to have a lot of splashing water on top of this, and that means the edge right here is going to be entirely lost. So we can be quite loose with it, but we still want a lot of fine detail in here. We're also going to be working on some foam created from the wave. So this is going to be an intricate spot, but it's going to teach you a lot. I'm going to start by mixing a bit more of that darker bluish green that we have. Like that, a little bit of titanium white. Like that a lot. Just test it up on my reference photo. Looks good. And now I'll start working this inwards. Remember, this side, it can be messy. It doesn't matter. But we do want to make sure we're not ruining this side. I'm going to leave a little bit of an opening for some highlight. I'm going to leave a little bit of an opening there for some foam. And we'll leave little lines and things of that nature. Most of mine are going to be decided from my reference photo, but if I feel the need to deviate, I will take some artistic liberties. It's entirely okay to make it your own and play with it. But here you can see lots of little openings, mostly in strands, because you want them to work in the same movements of the wave, feel like they're wrapping their way up or coming back down. There we go. Need a bit more water on my brush. You can see that I've colored in most of the areas in which I want this. Used a wooden colored pencil because it's relatively erasable on canvas and it doesn't dilute pigment like a charcoal or graphite might. Need to mix a bit more. Blue, a little bit of green, white, black. There we go. Doing a lot of shadow here because this larger splash will create a bit of a shadow as light won't be able to work its way through the entirety of it. Also probably looks like I'm getting a bit more loose back here. Things are getting slightly more open, and that's because they are. Here we have lots of smaller, almost strands. Here it's more clusters. And you can see that all of these openings are different from one another. That's so important. We want it to be evolving and changing. We want it to feel natural and organic. That's a word, organic. If you go to art school, you probably hear that word a lot. The idea of making something feel natural, not person-made. There we go. Okay, so we have our base in there. Looks quite good. It's good foundation. Now we'll start with the smaller brush to add some highlights. Remember, these are going to be a bit more green heavy. We use a good bit of titanium white, smallest amount of Mars black. I'm wiping off the excess. And then we'll come back in like this. And the foam here, for the most part, you want to have relatively sharp edges. So I'm not going to do a lot of blending with it, at least initially. But if you do decide to do that, make the top portions of the foam sharp and the bottom portions can blend down and into the darker pigments. There we go. This is also going to be significantly brighter in layers yet to come. Just building a base layer. It's a good pigment. We're working in very small areas, and this is where it's so important that your brush is damp, because That'll condense the bristles, it'll keep them together. And when you're doing smaller areas like this, make sure that you apply a very, very minimal amount of pressure with your brush. Because the more pressure you add, the more the bristles will expand and the larger the stroke you'll create. Okay, just checking my reference photo, making sure we're still working in the right spots. Good. Like that. Now I'm going to go ahead and continue doing this, but before I do that, I want to show you how we're highlighting this. So I have that original pigment. I'll add quite a bit of additional titanium white and a little bit of Mars black. That Mars black is going to work with the titanium white to make it a bit more gray and desaturate it, and that's a really good thing because we don't want it hyper saturated. I'm going to be applying this initially to the tops of the foam, and then I might do a little bit of a blend down. That really nice greenish blue will show through portions, be quite beautiful. And because we have that base layer, it won't look like a simple gray pigment. It'll look like a complex color. You can do little taps here and there for bits of wandering foam. Add some extra detail into areas you might feel are a bit bland. You can also expand upon different areas like that. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and do these in the same way as those, and then we will get back together and continue working on this big wave here. So as you can see, we continued moving down, working in that shadowy highlight that is a bit more green, but as I moved this way, I did integrate more Mars black and titanium white, making it a bit more gray, because this area right here, it's really quite confined, and we have the light that's bouncing back and forth, reflecting all of the blues and greens from the waves. But as you move right out here, you don't get that anymore. Instead now you get a lot more of the reflections from the sky, and so it isn't kind of green and blue bouncing back and forth in this area. There just isn't as much reflective close light like that. So here we are going to continue with that same brush, but we're going to take quite a bit of titanium white, the smallest hint of cerulean blue, smallest hint of turquoise green, and smallest hint of Mars black. We're going to create a very bright grayish bluish green mixture, and I've started right here. That way you can get a little bit of a visual start as to what we're working on. But I'm going to go back over a lot of these highlights that we have, especially on the left hand side, and work them back this way. I want them to slowly start to run out as we move up. That way we do get that nice green through here, but an almost whitish gray over here. So there you can see the transition, and this is something that's probably going to happen over a couple of layers, especially here because we are layering light pigments over dark pigments. But this is quite fun because you can be really playful, create the foam in all of these little movements. You can almost create mazes and paths. But I like to work back and forth for the most part in these almost Z-like patterns. And then I fill in some areas, I don't fill in others. And I'm trying to make sure that the tops and the bottoms are all quite sharp. You can see that every time I go back and do this, that highlight gets a little bit brighter because we're building highlight on top of highlight. There we go. You can do some little taps for extra details in those more open areas. You can also leave some portions of the foam a little bit darker. So here, right in between this and this, we have this darker area. It's not as dark as the base layer, but it's an extra level of variance, and it shows that the foam isn't completely flat. It raises a little bit, and even it can have a little bit of a shadow. This is really only something I'm incorporating though as we get farther and farther to the left, because that foam is getting larger and larger, and we can see details and occurrences like that significantly more prominently. There we go. Let's build that up. Add more titanium white to our mixture. So here's a bit of a wide shot so you can see all of these little pieces now connected together. Right now I want to head back and work a little bit more on this. I do want it to extend out just a little bit farther, so we're going to take quite a bit of our turquoise green, a little bit of our cerulean blue, good amount of titanium white, small amount of Mars black. I'll test it right there, make sure that it is a similar color. It's just about the highlighted pigment, and that works great for what I want right here. And right now I'm just leaving a little opening because I'm going to have a lot of wave working its way over that, a lot of splash. And I just want a little bit of this to show through. So I'll also apply it in here, that way it is nice and cohesive. But that's about all we need to do there. Now, speaking of splash, I think to do this right, we need to start right under here. And for that, I do want to apply a good amount of pigment. So I'm switching back to this. I'm mixing up a nice highlighted greenish gray, like that. And you know what? I really want to test this on my reference photo. So I'll just bring this down, test it right there. It's pretty good. I think it needs a little bit more blue. So we'll add a little bit more blue. The blue is a darker value than our current mixture, so to balance it, we'll need to add more titanium white. And then we can apply this right underneath here, like this. And this is going to be the body of the splash. We're going to work it in between all of those new applications we just made. The smaller flat-headed brush is great for this because it does have that nice sharp edge and it can carry quite a bit of paint. There we go. Can be relatively messy around this. You can see I'm just working very loosely. And we're going to get it as close to our lower application as we can. Now we're going to switch to a new brush. This is a 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, and it's synthetic. I'm going to peel back the bristles of it until it looks quite old, quite disheveled, and now it has just hundreds of little bristles that kind of poke out in different directions. So when I make a tapping motion with it on the canvas, I'll render just so many different little impressions. This is great for splashing water. So now I'll take some titanium white, just like that, a little bit of our green. We want it to be mostly titanium white though. There we go. And I'll start the splashes right here because remember, this part is going to give off quite a lot of them. That's why we did all of our brush strokes in that way. And we're just going to start in this area. I'm applying very little pressure. Once the brush touches the canvas, I'm not moving the brush at all because if I do, it'll create strokes and I don't want that. But I am rotating my brush in the air to give me varied applications each time I press down. Now as I start to run out of pigment, I'm going to work my way out of that body of the splash. That way it looks like it's splashing out and getting lesser. There we go. Still applying almost no pressure. And we're going to do a lot of this later on, but I thought I'd just give you a little preview. We need to do quite a bit of it down there, which we'll do next. But this is a great place to practice. We're working our way around that edge of the wave that was a bit more highlighted. This separates the side of it from the bottom of it. And I'm going over a lot of this a number of times until I get what I actually want. If you feel like you're worried about maybe doing a little bit too much, take a little bit of a break, go and do something else for a minute, come back, that way you get a fresh view of the painting. But I think I'm quite happy with that. Now I'm going to head down and do this area. However, this area, it isn't going to be that almost white because this area has a lot of shadow and a lot of reflected light. That's why this is the color that it is. So we actually need more of that pigment. So we'll get significantly more green, a little bit more blue. And you do have to be careful when you're mixing pigments with this brush because you really don't want the bristles to kind of condense. You can test right over here, make sure that they haven't. And provided they haven't, you can go back in and start doing that splash. If they have, just clean your brush really, really well under some water, then dry it. That way the bristles don't stick together. And then come back and just reapply that pigment. So here you can see I'm working my way over that rough edge we initially created. I'm working it over the foam that we created. And I'm working it out into this area. But that's essentially where we need to stop because this, remember, isn't going to get all of that green and blue reflected light. So we're going to take a little bit of a pause with that moving that way. We're going to move in here with a bit more titanium white. Maybe a little bit of Mars black. Make it a little bit brighter, but also a bit more gray. And at this point, I definitely have too much pigment on my brush. So I'm just going to wipe that off on a paper towel, clean it quite well, dry it quite well on just another area of that paper towel. It's now dry. I'm peeling back those bristles yet again. Wasn't cleaned perfectly, but didn't need to be. Grab some of that pigment we mixed, start up here at the top, and then work this down. And here you want a gradient from that lighter gray into that green, but you don't want a traditional gradient in a soft blend. You want it via a series of taps and impressions. Just like that. You also want to avoid going over this line right here. If you do, that's okay. We can go back and clean that up a little bit later. I can actually see an area I do want to clean up myself. So it's just one of those things you accept, and that's okay. But here you can see it's building quite nicely. Work a little bit of this over here because it's not as green. Continue to make it less and less so. It's quite gray. It's really not a bad thing. We'll try it over here, see how it blends. Give it a bit more blue, a bit more green. I'm going to test that up in my reference photo. It's quite good. And we'll build on top of this a great deal a little bit later on. This is really our base layer. And you can see that I'm letting those little taps move over the bottom areas of our water and our foam. And there's a little bit of a blend back. So not only do we have a gradient from the lighter gray up here to the more green down here, we also have the more grayish blue here into that greenish gray there. And then this is also something that'll work its way around that more green area of the wave and the top. We're not going to go too much farther though, because as we get higher and higher, things are going to get a lot more interesting. We're going to incorporate another new color and continue to diversify. But this is just that first base layer. Now we're going to take our smaller flat-headed brush and head into this area right here. So I'm going to begin by making sure that it's nice and damp. Then I'll head to my palette, grab some Cerulean blue, about half that with our green, good amount of Mars black, and a hint of white. This will be a good base layer for shadows in here. And as you can see, it actually already has quite a bit of pigment covered up with white. I did paint this, I did teach this, and then I realized, you know what? I can do this in a much better way. So we're redoing it here. I'm taking this brush, I'm going to start predominantly from this bottom little area right here, which we had begun previously, and I'm going to start working my way up, moving in that bit of a motion. And we're going to start creating some taps as we start working our way up, like that, creating some shadowy areas for our waves. Areas that there just isn't going to be a lot of light. So we'll have these streaks of light, we'll have this streak of dark, and eventually it'll all kind of combine into what we have right here. It'll be a little bit different, but it'll be quite similar. So I'm just following these lines of dark and light, trying to make them inconsistent, leave little openings, and make sure that they're not the same size from here to here, here to here, here to here, that we're always diversifying. Then I'll take quite a bit of Cerulean blue, quite a bit of titanium white, the smallest hint of green, and some Mars black. And previously we were trying to make our darker pigments significantly more cerulean blue heavy, our highlights significantly more turquoise green heavy, but I'm starting to switch that. So now, both of which are going to lean more on cerulean blue, because we're going to start working with a pink soon, and it'll transition so much more nicely. So right now I'm just working my way in between all of those open spots that I left from before, and I'm just filling that in. It may blend a little bit if that darker pigment is still wet, and that is okay. It just means that this new application will be a little bit darker, but I do want to go over this a couple of times, so that's really not the worst thing. But right now, I am just continuing to take more of that mixture, mix more of that mixture, and apply it to those smaller openings. Don't need much cerulean blue, or rather turquoise green there. But this is really just the first layer, and we will be cleaning it up and making it look a lot more interesting in just a second. There we go. Now I'm going to switch to the smaller rounded pointed brush that we've been using for so much of this. Going to make sure it's nice and damp. Going to head back to the darker pigment we were working with. And I'm going to start creating some lines that are working in the direction of the wave from the shadowy portions that we've previously rendered. And I'm just going to work those up in our wave. This is going to give us some direction, some leading lines, make it dynamic, give us some extra detail. Now we'll get even closer, switch to our titanium white, make that brighter pigment we were working with just a bit brighter, and now we'll come back in to the tops of those highlights and work our way back down. And this is really just about balance. We are highlighting the top of the waves. We are letting the bottom portions slowly get darker. We're trying to integrate movement, making it all feel cohesive. There we go. We can bring some of this up into these portions of our waves as well. Just make sure it all connects. And admittedly, this is an area that's going to look a little bit messy initially. It's going to take some work, it's going to take some time, but that's okay. It all pays off in the end. And you know, we've already put so much work into the rest of it. Be a shame not to treat this with the time it deserves. So, heading back into here, create more of those highlighted strokes again in the main movement of the wave. And you can of course start connecting them as well, as we have with our other waves. See how this one and this one now connect via these two strands? We can do that back here as well. Bring that highlight up. Do some little taps. Really similar techniques to what we did right up there. So now that we have the majority of the body of the wave finished, we're going to head into the foreground here. And this is water. It's very close to us, to the point where it's actually going to be out of focus. So for this, we want a very smooth blend. Now when I say that, I think a lot of us think, okay, great, we'll go and we'll grab a round-headed brush. However, I'm going to do something that's a little counterintuitive here. I'm actually going to be using a larger flat-headed brush. This one is 1 inch wide, and I'm going to use it because it can just apply so much paint so quickly. And if we apply these strokes with a very, very soft touch, we should be able to get a consistently smooth blend. So with that, I am going to use this brush. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and damp so that our pigment stays wet longer and so that our bristles stay kind of condensed. And I'd also like to note that I added a little bit of cadmium red light hue to the palette. We're going to have some pink in the sky over here. It's going to be reflected down in the water right here. So it's good that we get started with that. Now, I have everything mapped out, and I'm going to begin here with my highlights. So I'll take quite a bit of titanium white, a small hint of red, a small hint of cerulean blue. We're essentially phasing out the green at this point, and I'll also take a small hint of the Mars black. Mix all of these together, make it nice and consistent so it doesn't look streaky, but we have a single cohesive pigment, like that. Looks almost white, but it is a gray. I'm just going to test it up on my reference photo. It's really quite nice. And then I'll start applying that right down here in all of the open spots that I have not colored in. And we're going to try, and I do say try, to do a lot of this wet into wet. So I'm going to work relatively quickly. But I'm not going to stress out if we don't get it all wet into wet. That is okay. We can always come back and continue to play with it. In fact, I'm almost certain we won't get it all wet into wet. So again, don't worry about it. Now I'm going to make sure that my brush is nice and damp. I'm going to grab quite a bit of cerulean blue, a little bit of our red, a fair amount of Mars black, about almost an equal mixture of titanium white. The black is a stronger pigment, so it will overtake it. We will be left with a darker bluish gray. And this will be fantastic for the foreground. It's not too saturated, so it won't steal the attention from our larger wave, but it'll still be nice and cohesive. Here you can see it blending already with the almost white that we have. Working relatively loosely here initially, just trying to follow my drawing. I'll work a hint more blue and a hint more black into it, and then I'll use that down here for the bottom so that we have a nice vignette effect. Then I'll head back into our highlights and I'll move over them very, very softly with my brush. Try to create a smooth edge on all sides, like that. This is exactly what we wanted. That way it looks nice and out of focus. Going to grab more of our white, throw it in here. At this point it is all still wet into wet blending, but if you find that yours has started to dry, just use a little bit more water on your brush. Keep those wets more malleable, and it may rejuvenate the pigments that are just starting to dry. You can also just go back and forth with those highlights and darks as I did here until you get what you want. Now that right there is very blended and very soft, which isn't a bad thing, but I do want a little bit more form. So now we're going to switch to a 1/2 inch filbert brush. You can see it doesn't have any sharp edges. Going to grab some of those nice highlights, start working this in the middle of the highlights that we have on here, and then I'll blend them out on all sides. See that? Grab some more, work our way up here. And we want there to be a slight transition from this into this, so I'll work a little bit of this more grayed highlight on top of the highlights back here. And then I'll make a darker version of what we're currently working with for our shadows. Mix that up. Start applying that in the middle of the darker portions. And my pigments are starting to dry now, so I'm starting to work wet onto dry, which means we'll see slightly more brush strokes and tooth in the canvas, but that's okay at this point. You can see that there is a little bit of red showing through on these current mixtures. Like that a lot, works really well against the greenish blue of the waves. They are complementary colors. They do work really quite well together. The blue and the red also, of course, mix to make purple, which is quite beautiful in an ocean. Here you can see I'm starting to make things a bit more defined. When I go over the edges of the highlights and the darks, I'm working my brush extremely softly. Just going back over areas until we get what we want. And then I'll also create some smaller shadowy areas right up here to show that there's a transition from this to this, both in hue and value. Also though, in pattern a little bit. So we get these smaller openings and changes, and then they get larger and larger as we get closer to us. Still doesn't look quite right, but we're definitely moving in the right direction. Let's get more of that dark pigment. Work it in here. So far, so good. All of the highlights are, of course, the light shining down. All of these darker areas are the shadows. They're just not in focus. Getting much darker now. Using that as a reference for what we had for our previously applied darkest pigment. Start down here because it needs to be the most prominent, being that it starts the vignette. Deviating a little bit from the reference photo here, but just because I feel like I have something really nice going on, and just going to kind of trust myself. Remember, it's okay to take artistic liberties. Things like reference photos and traceables are great if you do struggle with the drawing or color matching process, but don't let them hold you back. If you feel inspired, if you really want to try something, if you have a great idea, you know what, just go for it. Give it a try. Sometimes I get messages asking if it's okay if people deviate from my lessons and they add their own portions of things, and I actually love that. I think it's so great when, you know, those added creative elements are worked in there and, you know, people build on these things and personalize them. I love it when it, you know, can change and really mean something to you. So even with my lessons, please feel more than welcome to make changes and just make it however you like. These lessons are here to teach you, to help you, to get you towards creating paintings you really love. And if that means following them to a T, that's great. If that means deviating and being a bit more playful, that's also great. As long as you're happy, you're enjoying the process, then the goal is met. Adding a bit more pink into this, as you can see. Not too much, but enough to diversify the color. Starting to make the tops of the lighter areas a little bit sharper and blending downwards so that bottom is nice and soft still. There we go. That's a soft blend. Almost there. It'll look a little abstract until we have the sky in place. And the colors will start to make a lot more sense when we add the sky as well. It's one of those things where you just kind of need to trust the process. There we go. That's nice. Okay, so I really like the form. I really like the variance in contrast. Now I just want to connect this color-wise a little bit more. So into our highlights, I'm going to throw some extra cerulean blue, extra titanium white. That way it leans a little bit farther away from the red and the gray. I'll apply just a little bit of this to the tops, in the back, and I'll let it slowly run out. So you move farther and farther away. Do a little bit of a soft blend down. So far, so good. So here we have a slightly wider shot, and at this point I really am quite happy with the water here in the foreground, though I do think it is unfinished. I want more sharp edges in it, I want a little bit of additional detail, but I don't want to incorporate that quite yet, because the majority of the focus at the end of this should be right here in the splashing of the wave. And if we add too much detail and too many sharp lines right down here, we really run the risk of making it a distracting area and leading the eye away from where we want it. So first, we need to establish this detail, see how much we have and how much we can afford right down here without it becoming distracting. So that needs to happen first. We're going to put that on a break, but before we do this, we actually need to work on the sky, which is currently, as you can see, a lot of very wet titanium white paint. And it looks like that because I actually started working on the sky, and then I had another one of those moments where I said, you know what? This could actually look a lot better. I think I could teach this in a better way. So I said, okay, I'm going to let the sky dry, then I'm going to paint it fully with white, I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to restart. And I wanted to make a note of this because we've spent quite a grand amount of time at this point working on this, perhaps you love those, you're now going to work on the sky, and you say, oh, you know what? I don't love the sky. I've ruined it. I've spent so much time on this wave and this water and I love it, but you know, I don't like the sky. Should I restart the whole painting? The answer is no. We are working with acrylics. They are incredibly forgiving. If you don't like something, simply let that area dry, cover it up with white or black, and then start painting again once that is fully dry. I don't want to go into it right now because if I did, all of my new pigments would mix with this titanium white. They'd be diluted, they'd be brighter, but once it's dry, we are in the clear. And again, because we're working with acrylics, we don't have to worry really about built-up texture. So incredibly forgiving. Don't worry about quote-unquote messing up the painting at the end of the painting because you can just redo these things. All it really does is take, you know, an extra 10-20 minutes in additional flat layers and drying. So anyways, at this point, I really am just going to let this sky dry. Then once it is, we'll go ahead and paint it. We'll paint some land masses in the background here. We'll work on a lot of the really nice splattering effects right here, a lot of that splashing. Then we'll head back to this area. So with that said, this is a great time to, you know, maybe make a snack, have a tea, you know, just continue to relax, enjoy that painting process. Make sure you're hydrated, make sure you're happy, and then, you know, we'll get right back to it. But I will see you in just a second. So my sky is now fully dried, and I taped my reference photo here so that I can test colors and just make sure that the values are what they need to be. So I'm going to begin with that larger flat-headed brush. It's 1 inch wide. I'm going to grab a lot of titanium white, a little bit of my cerulean blue, and a little bit of my Mars black. Mix these together, and our goal right now is to mix something quite similar to this. So I'll give it a test. It's significantly too bright, and it definitely needs to be more blue. So I'll grab some extra blue, some extra Mars black, work these together. And I am mixing significantly more pigment than I normally do because we are working on such a large area. So I'll throw in a little bit of red here. And also more Mars black. It's a relatively bright sky, but it's not that bright. So I am having to go back and try a number of different mixtures here. And that's okay. Don't feel like you need to go with the first mixture you make on your palette. Can feel great to kind of guess and get it the first time, but it's better to take a little bit of extra time and make sure it's just right. Okay, so I like this a lot. I'm going to start applying it right up here, top right-hand corner. we're going to apply a fairly thick layer to begin with. So I'm not going to start stretching this all the way over here, all the way down there. I have a good amount of paint and we don't need to move it out, because the more we move it out, the more we thin it. So I'm just trying to make sure we have a consistent application. There again, I'm quite happy with it. We'll mix more. We've mixed it once, but it did require quite a bit of altering, so the second time mixing it probably will also take a bit more work, but that's okay. Every time we mix this, we will get better at it, and it will get more consistent. Here occasionally you can see a little bit of blue or red show through, and that's just because while we were doing this, we didn't do a lot of working back and forth, and we didn't mix all of those pigments perfectly together. We got the general mixture, which was correct, but there was slight hints of unblended red and blue, which did end up on the brush, and eventually here on the canvas, which is okay. Just something to watch out for. So we completed the right-hand side. It's that nice blue that we want, but as we get towards the middle, we get more of a purple. So we'll work some extra red in there. Because red is a darker value than what we had, we need more titanium white. Give that a go. It's pretty perfect. So we'll apply that right in the middle. Get a soft blend with the blue that we have on the right. The blue on the right has just about dried, but the damp brush is allowing me to work on top of it, and it's giving us a slight gradient, which is quite nice. And as we move farther to the right, we're going to make this even more purple. So blue and red, make that nice purple. Make it a bit brighter. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the rest of the sky here, continuing this color that way, continuing this color that way, and again, we'll get that soft mix in the middle. Of course, right now the sky is void of clouds. We are going to add those in just a minute, but I wanted a base layer that had the correct values and showed us the general movements of colors. I'm also going to work a smaller landmass down here, which is going to be a bit of a darker purple. So we'll grab some blue, some red, white, hint of black. Start that right about here. Have it come down to there. And we'll make this nice and thick. It's getting a lot of reflective light in the distance, which is why the landmass looks purple like the sky. And we'll just work this down. If you feel like it's no longer thick pigment because you've moved it too much, go back to your palette, grab some more. There we go. And now I'm going to do another landmass, which is going to be a bit closer and a bit darker. So we'll just add additional Mars black to that. Won't make it too dark, but definitely darker than what we had. And this will be more of a horizontal line. It's also worth noting that the majority of this will be covered up in a little bit by the splashing water. So now when we take a step back and we look at our wide shot, what we see is a very, very unfinished painting. The waves in the foreground need details and highlights. This wave needs details and highlights. We need to clean up that top edge. We need to do all of that splashing water, and we need to go and add some clouds. The next step is going to be adding those clouds, but I just wanted to take this second to show you that, yet again, the painting, it's not always going to look perfect. It's going to require different foundations. Sometimes you're going to see multiple at the same time, and that can lead to a not so aesthetic version of your piece. But it's all necessary to bring it to fruition and to make it something you really love and care about. So don't get discouraged if it looks a little simple or a little unfinished at this point, because we are about to go in, add a lot of detail, and make it truly something special. So with that, let's switch brushes and get right back into the sky and apply some really beautiful clouds. So now we're going to take this smaller round-headed brush. It's slightly pointed and it's about 1/4 of an inch. And we're going to start working on the clouds right here in this nice pink spot. So I'm going to start by making sure that it is nice and damp. Then we'll head to our palette. I'll grab some of the pink that we've been mixing with, and I'll make it just a hint brighter and just a hint more pink. Now this brush will be great because it won't leave really sharp applications, and we'll be able to keep things relatively soft and subtle. Now I'm going to begin right up here, fairly close to the top, and I'm going to create a lot of very round applications to create the edge of our cloud. And the edge of the cloud is going to be catching quite a bit of light through it, where the body of the cloud is much more dense. So it's not going to have as much pink, and it's not going to be as bright. But here, as you can see, we're now moving down. I created this other little cloud that protrudes. Saw that on the reference photo, and I thought, you know what, that's quite fun. And so I'm just continuously playing back and forth. And now once I have that edge established the way I want, I'm going to take the extra pigment off my brush, make it a little bit damp, and then I'll work yet again with a bit of a rounded stroke, and I'll move all of this pigment backwards. I'll let it slowly become more and more transparent. We're essentially working wet onto dry right now, so we're not actually blending. We're just letting the pigment run out and also have some transparent layers that show through, just like that. And I'm essentially taking it to the point where there is no longer a difference between the sky and the cloud. So it's very soft, very subtle. This is the underside. It's a little bit darker because, again, the light just can't work its way through that area, as well as the edge because it is more dense. But let's get a bit more of that highlighted pigment. And we can build up different areas of that side, make them a bit larger, make them a bit brighter. But this is a really, really fun part of the painting. I always love painting clouds, and these are just such a joy. Working with this color palette, I think it's so beautiful. There, I'm just softening that. But I'm using the edge of the brush for the majority of these blends. I might also make that one a little bit brighter. I'll have this come down to here, then maybe it dips back down this way, then it'll re-emerge. And get the tail out over there. Just starting to get playful with it. Started with something simple, something manageable, something easily understandable, and now we're continuing in slightly more interesting ways. You can also take a lot of that pigment off your brush and then go and create other semi-transparent clouds that are just working their way off. Diversity is such a key in paintings like this. When you want things to look real, you need to make sure that they're always evolving and it's not the same application or process over and over again. There we go. So you really want a mixture of opacities and shape as well. Let's create another portion of the cloud that can kind of hook down. So I'll take this, say, you know what, I like this a lot. Do we want to do that here? Do we want to do that here? Let's go with more of a highlight there. And then here we have a second cloud right underneath. Doing the same thing. A little bit more subtle though. Let's get you a little bit closer. Now we've been working with a very light purple for the highlights, but it's also important to remember that there are going to be darker portions of the cloud as well. So I'll take that same brush, and that's my highlight. I'll make something darker than it. I'll do that right beside, that way we can compare and contrast. First things first, we need a purple. So red and blue. Then we'll add some titanium white, thicken it, desaturate it just a little bit, and a hint of Mars black, but not too much. We'll give this a test right down here because this is really where we want it. Looks darker, looks significantly darker. I like that a lot. So this is going to be the bottom of our cloud. It's going to have significantly less light, so it'll be this darker pink. And we'll just start moving it over here towards the right. We'll let it dissipate, get softer. Then I'll take all of that extra pigment off my brush, and with a damp brush, I'll go into the top of it, kind of using the edge of this rounded brush, and I'm doing a little bit of a blend upwards, just like that. It's a great way to build a little bit of extra detail in the distance, in those clouds. And you might want to soften the actual edge on the bottom, just a hint, but you're not going to drag it as far down. I'm really just working over it very, very tightly. Where this, it was a real movement upwards. You can also take that mixture, brighten it, just a hint, not too much. And you can work that up as well. So you don't have to necessarily continuously move up with that single darker pigment. You can adjust it, play with it, and work up with a number of these. There we go. I think we'll go back to the darker and play with that for another minute. With that said, I would like to use this time here to say a big thank you to all of our patrons for supporting and producing this lesson. It wouldn't happen without you and your support. I make a real note to say that in each and every one of these lessons because I think it's really important. I am very grateful, and you know, this is primarily a fan-funded show. These lessons would not happen, and they especially wouldn't happen each and every week without those of you supporting the channel, so I would like to say a really big thank you. I hope that the traceable and the reference photo are extremely useful for this one. I know that I've been using that reference photo a lot for testing colors in between shots and just making sure we're going in with the right things. And we will need to use it again in a second just to redraw the wave that we lost. But, you know, just a little thank you for supporting the channel. I've actually painted over the sky 4 or 5 times this video just because I feel like there's been so much support for the channel and these seascapes. I want them to be absolutely perfect for you. And again, I wouldn't have the time to paint over the sky 4 or 5 times if it wasn't for that support. There we go. If you've been following the channel for a long time, this segment where I do say thank you might be a little bit annoying, but I think it's something that needs to be said often, frequently, and in each and every one of these. If you are new to the channel, however, you can support the channel up over on Patreon. It's a great way to just say thank you, but it's also a great way to get plenty of extra bonus rewards. Up there, we do have the traceables, the reference photos, a bunch of bonus lessons. I have all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, in which we talk about the essentials and everything you need to know before you jump into your first acrylic painting. Talk about composition, how to mix colors, how to use water, all of that good stuff. I also have a couple books of traceables for different landscapes. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where we all kind of share artwork and help each other out, ask questions, all of that. And at higher tiers, I also do personalized art reviews. So there is a lot of really fun stuff up there. If you're interested, there will be a link in the description. But you'll also be directly supporting the channel and helping ensure that I'm able to continue to make these each and every week. It's just something I really loving doing while working on these seascapes. There we go. Look at that. So we're slowly just building up these highlights, these darker values, and if you feel like these get a little bit too dark, you can always go back over them with a highlight and just play with it. It's the beauty of acrylics. Nothing's ever kind of stuck. I like that a lot. Okay, from there I think we're going to move over to the right hand side and continue adding some clouds over there. That way we balance the painting a little bit more. With that said though, we don't want as many clouds over on the right hand side because this cloud structure right here, it's balancing the detail in this. And if we add too much detail up here, then we run the risk of making the eye and the attention go over to the right-hand side of the painting and not the left. So it's all a balancing act, but we'll keep it in check and we'll just keep on painting some really relaxed clouds. Now we're going to continue with that rounded brush. I'm going to look at the highlight pigment that I had for my pink, move a bit of it to a clean spot here on my palette, and I want to mix something that's a combination of it and a light blue of the same value. So I'm just throwing this together quickly, like that, putting them right beside each other, saying, okay, you know what, those two look really similar, we just need some pink. Now I want a bit more blue, and it looks like we'll need to brighten that value up once more. There we go. So I'm going to make my brush nice and damp, grab a little bit of it, and say, okay, you know what? I think we'll have a cloud moving this way. So I'll start right there. You can see I'm working with almost just pure water. It's extremely easy to move around, very fluid. And then I'll say, okay, you know what? We'll create a larger cloud right there, coming down from the top. These clouds are going to be more blue because they are over to the right hand side. And yet again, I'm just going to do that blend back that we did with our pink. There we go. Creating a couple different interesting clouds in this one. I think we'll have a cloud moving down this way. And this time we'll work it back to the right hand side. So we have our established edge, and now we have our blend. It's very subtle. If we decide we really like any of them, we can always go back and apply more layers. But this is the safest way to start. And remember, we want this side to be more subtle. Get a bit more. You can see I'm holding my brush a little bit differently. This is generally a more loose way to work, which is great for rendering fluffy clouds like this. Acrylic paints do dry a little bit darker, so as this dries you will notice that there are slight changes, but that's okay. There we go. Very soft right there. I like that. I feel like this might be a little bit too stark, so it still might be wet. I'll take a wet brush. I'll see if I can just move this about. I can. Okay, great. So we can soften that quite dramatically with some extra water, just spread it out. Maybe do some finger painting. Have to love just how easy acrylics are to fix and manipulate. Get some extra titanium white, brighten this up a hint, head back in here. You can see that it's significantly more bright and opaque than what we were just using, but don't let that worry you, because once we start blending it, it will get less and less opaque. And we're only doing this because we like this area and we wanted to further pronounce it. There we go. Going to build in a secondary highlight inside, so it kind of dips in here, but it has another area that's back there. So we're adding some extra dimension to this one. Like that. Oh, that's really nice. Create some softer, smaller clouds up here. Making my brush nice and wet so that I can really play with them. There we go. Maybe a little bit of a connector between this and this. I know I'm not speaking as fast, or as well as I was before. I'm thinking a lot while I do this. Generally, through these lessons, I've kind of, in my head, figured out what we're going to do next. Or I just follow the reference photo, and it's a much more streamlined process. So I'm able to talk and articulate to a better extent. But here, because we are just figuring it out together, and it is something we're being playful with and just constantly adjusting, I have a lot more of my focus on it. But this should go to show just how much thought you should be putting into it. It's not something where, you say, oh, well, I'll just try something right there. Or, we're constantly looking at the movements of the clouds, how they'll lead into one another, how this works like this because this works like this. They both have this arch that moves inwards, creates some leading lines. I'm creating a couple to bridge the gap between our pink clouds and our blue clouds, but I'm making them very small because I don't want it to compete and make this a larger blue cloud and then have the painting kind of split in half with pink and blue. I want them to work together. There we go. But I think I think that does it for the clouds that I want right there. Very happy with that. Quite subtle. More so than in the reference photo, but the reference photo gave me the ideas for the compositions and the movement, so very happy to work with that. With that said, we are now going to jump back down here into the splashing water and finally continue our wave. You know what, I said that? We should probably do the top of the arch first. Yeah, it'll make layering a lot easier. Okay, that's what we're going to do next. We're going to hop into this, so I'm going to switch my brush, and then we can work on that. And that'll be really exciting. So, as we head back into this, I'm going to be using the 1/4 inch flat-headed brush. We'll grab some of our cerulean blue, some of our turquoise green for the first time in a long time. And I would like to note, I started editing the video, and I noticed that on camera, this doesn't really look green. I'm not really sure why my camera isn't picking that up. I've tried changing the settings a number of times, and it just isn't coming through. So if your turquoise green looks significantly more green, that's a-okay. It should. I'm really not sure why it's not picking that up, but your painting might look a little bit more green if you've been doing the mixes I've been suggesting, and that's not a bad thing at all. That's what mine looks like, despite the camera not wanting to kind of show you. But you can go for a more blue wave if you'd like. You can go for a more green wave if you like. What's interesting about having the teal and green, and this actually is a pretty good representation of it. I don't know why it's not doing that on the palette. Yeah, wow, that's so strange. But this is pretty accurate, and this is interesting because if we have more cerulean blue down at the bottom, more cerulean blue here, more cerulean blue in the sky, then this stands out because it has that extra green. So it just gives it a slight diversity. Here I'm creating a sharp line with this brush, which is fairly easy because it has a nice sharp head to it. And then I'm adding a highlight on the top. I'm working that highlight back down, and I'm using a lot of those same patterns and techniques that we used just right below. However, we also made darker mixtures as well for that space, so we'll get some Mars Black, find those openings, and just go back and forth. Now, I used the smaller round-headed brush at the point initially for this. You can use the flat-headed brush if you predominantly work with the corner because it will give you a sharper application. As you can see here, it's starting to get the same effect, just with a little bit of extra highlight. There. I love doing this. So much fun. Okay. I do think, though, I will switch back to that initial brush. Just show you that technique again that way. It's retained. And should you want to go and work on a seascape a month from now, these are things you'll remember. Softening some of the lines at the bottom and doing a slight blend into that darker mixture. See that? And now it really does look nice and cohesive. Get a bit more cerulean blue for the darker areas, which we'll go back into. Remember, in the middle of the wave, highlights are more turquoise green, shadows are more cerulean blue. So as you can see, I continued that detail all the way down to the bottom of the wave, and now we just need to let that dry, because if we were to continue this splashing effect with that, we may accidentally pick up some of that fairly saturated blue and green, and we just don't want that. We want the splashing to be significantly more subtle. So while I wait for that, I'm actually going to head back in to this area and just draw out the splashing effect that we initially drew, but that was lost when we painted the sky and the land masses there. I'll probably use an erasable woodless colored pencil or some Conte, because as we know, graphite and charcoal can dilute pigment, and we are going to be working with quite bright pigment. So I will see you in just a sec with the drawing back on the canvas. Now we're going to continue working on this wave right here, and most of it's going to be done with that 1/2 inch flat-headed brush that we peel the bristles back on. However, I really don't want to mix all of our pigment with it, because when you do mix a lot of pigment, the bristles tend to stick together, and that'll have the opposite effect of what we want. So I'm actually going to take the 1 inch flat-headed brush and mix the colors that we want initially here, and then I'll just grab them with the other brush. I'm going to start by mixing up a blue heavy purple. I'm going to make it quite desaturated, and we're going to aim for a mid-tone. So we'll grab a little bit more black, put that in there, and I'll give this a test. I think that's a really nice base pigment, but it could be just a hint brighter. So work some extra titanium white in there. Test that, and that looks really nice with the painting. So I'll put the other brush down. I will peel back the bristles on this older brush, just like so. And then once we have something a little odd looking, I'll grab that pigment and we'll start tapping that onto the canvas. I'm going to work it initially along the edge that we previously created with the more green taps. And I'm going to start trying to make a pretty seamless transition between them. We can still have a small bit of green down at the very bottom, but we want the majority of this to start adopting this very grayish, pinkish purple. And it's always great when your color, when you're describing it, it's not simple. It's a grayish pink purple. It means it's complex. It means the eye initially doesn't always know what it is, and therefore it can demand more attention and for a longer period of time, while the viewer kind of lets it sink in and tries to figure it out. Now, as I'm doing this, you can see that the canvas is jumping a little bit, as is the easel. So in this process, I would try to make sure that everything is fairly well secured. I'm now going to go ahead and mix some additional paint, because we just about ran out of what we had there. This time I'm going to make it slightly brighter. So that is my initial mixture. I'm mixing right beside it so I can see that contrast. There we go. Definitely getting brighter, but we don't want it too bright, because we still want room to grow, and we still want to make it pop even more so. There we are. A little bit more blue, and I think we'll have what we want. That looks great. So I'll put this brush back down, grab the older flat-headed brush, and we'll head back. Yet again, we start on the edge, and we work our way down and inwards. I'd also like to note that we are still rotating our brush in the air in this process, but not on the canvas, because if we rotated it on the canvas, we'd create the swirling effect of pigment, and we don't want that. Now I'm starting to move out of the body here, And this is where it's going to get a little bit different, because up until this point we've been trying to cover essentially everything. We don't want open spaces for the most part. But as you get towards the edge, the splash, it thins out, it widens, and you don't get the same effect necessarily, because you see the background through portions of it. So when I grab the paint now, I'm going to start more in the middle, I'm going to work my way out, but I'm going to start making my taps slightly farther apart. And I'm going to try to let it just dissipate. It's very much like creating a transparent edge or blend, in that you want the middle to be the most opaque, and then as you move towards that edge, the pigment, the application, it gets softer, it gets lesser, and we get something more subtle. There we go. I am going over some areas of the middle, as you can see, a couple of times, just to ensure that we are still getting a fairly thick application, but then as we get back up here, it is significantly lesser. And we're working our way back through here. I'm going to try and make this sharper line remain, and that means I will do a little bit of a drag down at the bottom, but then I will quickly go back over it with a tap, and I'll also work my way now over some of our wave. This is just our base layer. We will be adding highlights to it. And this top area is significantly more purple and pink because it's getting all of this purple pink reflective light, where again the bottom area is getting the colors of the water kind of bouncing back and forth. Now we're going to let that background dry, and in the meantime we're going to clean our medium-sized flat-headed brush quite well. Then we're going to dry it very thoroughly and peel back those bristles yet again. We want that base layer to be fully dry before we go in and work on it, because we're going to add a lot of highlights and we don't want them mixing too much with that previously applied pinkish purple layer. So we're just kind of making sure we are set up and ready to add some really beautiful details. So our mist is now dry to the touch, so I'm going to take that same 1-inch flat-headed brush and mix up something that's a bit brighter than what we have currently here on the palette. So I'll start with some titanium white. I'll grab a hint of our red, a hint of our blue, and then an even smaller hint of Mars Black, and we'll mix those together. I'm doing so on top of our initial mixture, that way we are sure that it's going to be a little bit brighter and a bit more blue as well. We can do this in a couple of layers. We don't have to build all of the highlights in a single one, and in fact, the more layers you do with the slightly different variations, the more interesting it will become. So I'll put that other brush down, grab the older brush. I'm going to start right around here in the middle, and I'll start with that splashing. Rotating my brush, not applying much pressure, working our way out towards some of the edges. And the more pigment you apply, the softer and softer the strokes will get, or the taps will get rather. And this is where you really get to build those delicacies in the wave. I think we'll build another highlighted area right here. We'll have it connect. You will see a little bit of structure going on throughout this. Get some more. This is really where a lot of the magic happens. Once I have almost none of it, I am working over into the areas that I don't want to be bright, but I do want more texture in. And you might not get physical texture that leaps off the page, but visual texture definitely has a large role to play here. So yet again, I'm almost out. So I'm working my way into some of those more purple pink areas that could just use a bit more detail. And we want to take it slow. We want to balance it. Don't just rush in and start applying it everywhere. I'm taking a lot of time here to actually look at the reference photo, see where it is, and how we can best match that or edit it, should we want to. Got more. Head up here. Throw some extra little spots in this. This time it's with more of a purple color, so it'll make it nice and diverse. And now I think we need to move to an even brighter value. So my brush still has a bit of that pigment on it. We'll simply add more titanium white. Still not a pure titanium white, but definitely getting brighter and brighter with each application. And you can wait for that layer to dry, but I think because the layer was so thin, I'm actually going to have no issue going back over it now. There we go. Yeah, look at that. Nice and easy. Still picking my favorite areas, building them up. Work this back over portions of our wave. Here you can see a prime example of how it all looks up close. Trying really hard to create a brighter area right there and have it work its way out, but I still want slight highlights splashing in all directions. It's all about finding that balance. So here you can see a wide shot of all of that splashing water and also a major change to the painting. I did like what we had here in the foreground, but I thought, what if we extended the wave? What if we continued this in a different direction? In a similar direction to that of what we've already done, but in a way that made the piece feel a little bit more open, and that way it really felt like you could move into the piece where that big splash is happening. So I'm going to make a change. You don't have to. You can stick with the foreground that we had pre-established. Maybe just add a little bit more detail, maybe slightly more highlights, but I'm personally going to take this in a different direction. I'm really excited about it, so I'm going to get you a bit closer and we'll jump right into it. So I'm going to start here with the smaller 1/4 inch flat-headed brush. I'm going to take some of our Cerulean blue, Mars black, turquoise green, and a little bit of titanium white. The goal here is to mix a similar pigment, value and color, to what we had right here, and I want to start moving that downwards. We're really going to expand this wave, we're going to expand the foam, and we're going to continue playing with all of these really nice techniques that we had established in the painting previously. I felt like that was really some of my favorite portions of the painting, and I just wanted more of them. So I'm starting with that, then we'll mix more of the mid value, so blue, turquoise, more titanium white than before. We'll give this a try. We're doing a lot of color matching right now. So here we're up close, and I am starting with a bit of a more simple base layer. We'll go in with the smaller brush and add our details in a minute. But right now, I'm really focusing on just making the movements of the wave correct. This is essentially what we did at the start of the painting. There we go. Let's get a mix of the highlight and the shadow pigment for this area right in between. And just make sure it's all cohesive and moving correctly. Here you can see that it's really quite dark, so we might add some extra Mars black. So here I'm just continuing to move farther and farther over here to the right-hand side of the painting, going back and forth between shadows and highlights. And I'm trying to get a soft blend between the two. That way it isn't too sharp or detailed just yet. Remember, when you're building the base layer, you're not looking for the most elaborate subject. You're looking for a thick base with the right colors, values, and movements. So I think I'm probably going to continue this through here, and I will see you once this is done. Now that we have all of those curved streaks in here, I'm going to head back up into this area with the smaller flat-headed brush. So for this, we'll start with a darker base layer of cerulean blue, about an equal mixture of our turquoise green, fair amount of Mars black, and a little bit of titanium white. And we want this darker value to match with the darker values that we have kind of interjected in this top area. So I just test it in a number of places, and then once I'm confident with it, I start moving it down. We want this layer to be nice and thick, and it is essentially just our base layer. So we're not looking for any real detail, but we are attempting to make all of these strokes in that same direction that we want the water to be moving. That way, if any of those brush strokes show through, things will look quite good. We can also make it just a hint darker because we are getting closer to us in the foreground, and the closer you get to the foreground, the more natural, innate coloring and values you see, because there's less atmospheric reflective light. These are things you really have to consider when you start working without the reference photo. I'm also going to start changing this a little bit, that way we have something that's slightly more consistent with the wave. This will be quite easy. I'll just work my way back up here. I'll keep the tips because they are useful for placement, and we will have some falling water. There we are. And I'll just move these darker pigments up so it's cohesive. And now I'll switch to a different brush so we can start working some detail in. That brush being the smaller round pointed brush. Going to get some titanium white, move that into our current mixture. We'll head up to the top and we'll continue some of the lines and strokes that we previously made. Now this is looking a little bit gray, and as you move closer to us, I do want more of that natural color, so we'll add more cerulean blue and turquoise green. There we are. Still working back and forth, creating openings. The applications right now are incredibly subtle because, of course, we are working on wet paint, so it's blending. But when you get a chance, make the top of the stroke sharp, and then go back and just blend down the bottom of that stroke. That way it's slightly more subtle, and it looks like a portion of the water is being raised, it's catching light, and then that light is dissipating down. See just how subtle that is right now. From there, we're going to take a much brighter version of that pigment, so extra titanium white. Going to go towards the edge, and I'm going to start creating some splashing water, and water that's about to come off this wave, and we'll do so in a couple of strands. And that's how I want you to think about it. It's essentially this line that's working its way across the wave, but it's not a traditional line. It's made up of all of these little taps and splashes, and you're just thinking about the water that is currently leaving the edge of this larger body of water. And I'll get you closer for this detail work. So here we are, still grabbing and making more of that highlight. Some of this is going to fall, so it's going to continue that movement down like that did, but other points are going to move up because we're going to have different layers and levels of water. And that's why it's like we're creating multiple sheets here. Here we have a top sheet, here we have a bottom sheet, and they both have slightly different trajectories. I'm blending back a lot of this pigment to the point where it blends in with our previous highlighted strokes, and these are blended back a little bit, but of course get lost under this new strand. Down here at the bottom where it gets smaller and more condensed, we're going to actually merge them and create a single edge, which we will blend back. So we want the sharper area of the application facing this direction, and then anything that isn't on that edge is soft. Here I'm going back, tapping on extra little pieces, embellishing it. There we go. And from there, we can switch back to that older half-inch flat-headed brush. I'll peel back those bristles. And we're not going to use a lot of paint here, so I'm not going to worry about mixing my paint with a different brush. I won't grab much, I won't mix much, I won't worry much. So here I'm just grabbing essentially everything we've been using, even the smallest tint of Mars Black. We want it to be mostly titanium white though. Here we're starting with a not so vibrant version. That way we have room to build. Now we'll add slightly more color and more titanium white, this time no Mars Black. You can see that it's slightly brighter, but not all that much because, of course, we're still mixing with that darker pigment as well. You can have areas that are falling a bit more and some that are higher up. Create that diversity, make it more interesting. We'll build it up yet again. More titanium white, predominantly here in the middle. And if you want, you can do a slight stroke if you want to create additional movement with the water. So I'm doing that in a couple of places, but it's not something you have to do. I think that's a really neat detail right there. So this, it's moving up, this is moving that way, this kind of splashes up in an arch. So it's kind of ever changing. There we go. Build it up probably one more time. Get the most important areas. Yeah, just like that. Maybe we'll continue it through here a little bit more. Balance as well. It's a really interesting wave. And we might have it drop farther down a little bit later, but right now I think this is all I want to do with that. So as you can see, we are now continuing to move down in the piece. I'm going to mix a bit of a darker blue to begin with here. I want the bottom of the wave to be quite a bit darker than the middle area because it's not going to be receiving as much light. So I'm going to work with a stroke like this, using this 1/4 inch flat-headed brush. I'm occasionally going to move it back up, but for the most part here, we're just creating this very consistent movement. It's also vital that our brush has a bit of water on it. That way it's thin enough to go over these dry areas smoothly and create some nice transitions. Need to do a couple of layers because, of course, that water is going to thin the pigment. We'll see the white of the canvas showing through, and when that happens, it looks brighter. And this does need to be a darker base layer, so just going over a bit of this a couple of times. Get some more Mars black, start straying away from the cerulean blue. No, start straying away from the turquoise green. We still want the cerulean blue. Other way around. As an update, it is now the next day. It is quite early in the morning, and I'm just kind of getting used to having a conversation. Feel like I should almost preface the changes of day and painting session, just so you know what to expect. Feel like when we're just getting started and when we're ending, things are a little bit more relaxed, maybe a little bit more friendly, goofy. The middle is generally the most informative part of the process, just because the mind has had some time to start jogging and the fine motor skills are warmed up and ready. But it's nice and kind of fun to have multiple ways of interacting and working with your painting. With that, I am now going to mix a darker green and continue moving out. This process is going to be very similar to doing the foam in the background, in that we're going to move out, leaving openings for the brighter foam that we're going to be painting. And we can connect this to our previous area. So what I did when I was drawing this out, I actually started from the open dark areas. And again, don't worry if you are over on Patreon and you do intend to use the traceable. I will have a traceable for both the version with the larger wave in the foreground and now this new version as well. That way you can pick your favorite. And again, you don't have to worry about changing it or the drawing process, anything like that. There we go. Trying to keep this consistently evolving. I'm not working from a reference photo for this portion because I am making it up, and that means I need to be extra cautious about not kind of subconsciously falling into the same idea or trope and that I'm consistently innovating on the movements. So here we are just mixing this very dark blue, a lot of Mars black, more cerulean blue than turquoise green, a little bit of titanium white, applying that down here, multiple applications, and I'm connecting it back into our larger wave. We should have the same value in hue as the bottom of the wave, and we're looking for sharp, clean lines. So if you see a lot of tooth in the canvas, try to go over that a couple of times, maybe use slightly more water on your brush, and you should have something that's significantly more consistent and clean looking. But we're going to essentially add some foam into all of these open spots. There we go. Just taking this extra pigment and making sure the rest of our wave is nice and opaque. Now we're going to switch back to the small, rounded, pointed brush. Make sure that it is nice and damp, and we'll mix up a tealish blue initially. So we'll use a bit more of our green than we will cerulean blue. Create a nice highlight. We'll have a hint of Mars black, but we want to start with this pigment right up close to the wave, and you can really start dragging it up from the open areas. I do want the majority of these to be clean, so again, try to avoid sloppy edges. It's easy to say, I have a lot of space to cover, so I'm just going to move quickly through it. But when we do that, we aren't as careful as we should be. So just make sure that you are being careful. Starting by filling in those open spots, and maybe I'll move it out. And now we'll need to mix a bit more paint. Now that we know we have the color we want. Mixing it on top of the initial mixture. That way I have a good reference point. There we go, nice and thick. This is essentially a base layer, and we will be adding highlights on top of it, so it is important that this layer is fairly opaque. When we paint the brighter layers later on, we'll do so, we'll allow them to be slightly brighter, but also more transparent, and these really beautiful blues and teals will show through. I'm also going to take some of these highlights and work them back up into the middle of the wave here. So this bottom area is going to be quite dark, this top area is going to be a little bit darker, and the real highlights are going to exist right in the middle. And that's because more light can pass through this area and more light can reflect on this area. It's a fairly interesting set of occurrences and effects. There we go. Again, while you're doing that, try to make sure it isn't all the same and that you're consistently diversifying. But anyways, we've essentially done the inner area, which is, again, a lot of that light reflecting back and forth, which is going to be more green. So as we move out here, we are going to use significantly more cerulean blue rather than turquoise green in our mixture. We'll also make it more gray. So I'm going to use more titanium white and more Mars black. I like it. I think it's just a little bit too dark. So, more titanium white. Good. With that, we did just mix a lot of pigment on our brush, and as you can see, it's quite full, to the point where it's actually difficult to render smaller marks. So I'm going to take all of that paint off my brush, make sure that it is nice and damp, then I'll head back in with significantly less on my brush, and really start again, but with a much more refined application. And this is honestly such a cathartic process. It's so enjoyable. It's one of those things that just feels natural in painting. I think there's a lot of this painting that's something you really have to contemplate. You really have to think about, why is this happening? How is it happening? How do I further kind of create this effect and this feeling? But with this, it just flows. No pun intended to the scene itself. So I'm trying to apply a bit of this more gray mixture on the edge of our bluish teal. I'm mixing it, I'm blending it, and that way we have a nice transition. There we go. I think we need something a bit darker just for a second. More blue, constantly adjusting, making things progress in interesting ways. There we are. And we're almost done our base layer. Good. So now it's time that we go back in with real highlights. So I'm taking a lot more titanium white, moving that down to the bottom of our mixture. And we essentially want the same value and color that we have right here. And we want to take that and move it closer to our wave. So I'm starting actually on top of that initial application. That way it's consistent and cohesive. And then I'm moving this way. Now it may blend with the previously applied still wet pigment. That isn't really a bad thing. It means that you might have to do more layering, but it's also going to give you more transitions and subtleties. So here I'm just working my way back like we did the first time. Consistently grabbing more titanium white, because every time I go and I apply pigment, I am picking up those greens, blues, and darker grays. For the most part here, you also see me doing a lot of line work. But it's imperative that we don't just do line work, because there's a lot of little breakaway pieces that we talked about initially. So we'll do one here, one there. They're not connected to anything. We'll do another here. Brighten that up. Just get playful, get creative, get original, and continue working on it. I think I'm probably going to put another 20 minutes into this part of the process, just refining and playing with these transitions, but I will see you for the next step. So as you can see, I continued working this up here. I stopped at about the middle mark in the kind of curve of the wave, and as I moved closer to us, I interjected more little detailed pieces. So over here, the foam, it's quite large, it's very connected, and then the closer you get to us, the more disconnected it is, because you see more of that detail when it is up close. I also, again, just continued to try to make the foam that's under the wave a bit more of this bluish teal, the foam over here a bit more of a white, and right in between I have both working kind of with one another. With that said, while I was doing that, I did test two different things, and I wanted to test them first. That way I didn't kind of lead you in the wrong direction. Both of which worked. I'm very happy about it. And the first thing is right up here in this wave. I took this smaller brush and took some titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, hint of cerulean blue, created this nice highlight that's similar to the wave. And I started just tapping on extra little details that essentially created a second line of waves right here, and then a very soft third one back here. Now, it is most prominent in the foreground, then it gets a little bit less prominent, and then it's, again, a bit softer. So just something to test out and try. I'm going to do another right up here for you to see. And I'm going to show you it at a distance because I think it'll just visually make more sense. So I created this via taps. I'm going to continue with those taps over to here, connect it into that, and then we just have this new little line of splashing wave. There we go. I'll get more titanium white, make it brighter, start at the brighter area of the wave, then I'll just start working this back. Now these markings are going to be slightly larger than that of the ones that you made with your disheveled half-inch flat-headed brush, but that's okay. We have so many different techniques in here, you won't really be able to tell the difference. But here, as you can see, we have another new kind of sheet of wave coming down. And obviously the more layering you do, the more you go back on top of it, the more you can pronounce it and make it even more visually impactful. But if you continuously go over it while it's wet, eventually you're just going to get a lot of blends and you're not going to get those small taps. So I would recommend letting some of these layers dry if you do find that they are starting to blend and you're not getting that nice sharp application that you really want. There we go. I think that's a really nice balance. But anyways, I just did that right there and there. Again, it'll be included in the traceable, but you can also just pause the screen and sketch it out should you want to. With that, there was one more thing that I tried, and that was just making the top of the wave a bit more soft and diffused. With that, I am using that same small pointed brush. I take some titanium white, very small amount of Mars black. We want a very light gray with the smallest hint of cerulean blue. Then I take all of the additional paint off my brush. I grab that, it's very thin, it's essentially a glaze, so it's not going to disrupt the shape or line, but it is going to add this slight change of value in color. So I apply it to the middle of the wave. I move it very quickly, very softly over to the left, over to the right, but the majority of it exists there. Then I just start to blend it down and a little bit up. That way we get this soft edge on the top of the wave, and it's like there's this tail of mist coming off that right there. And this is something you can do a couple of times. It is another one of those steps that I would recommend applying it, letting it dry, going back, applying more, letting it dry, and just building it up very, very slowly, because it can be a beautiful effect, but it can also quickly become this value, that bright, and you don't want that. So work on it over time and you'll get what you really want. So here we have a slightly wider shot where yet again you do get to see all of those new elements working in conjunction with one another. But when I step back, I noticed something very important, and that is we changed a fairly mundane gray bottom here to something that's very sharp, vibrant, and detailed. And therefore, we actually changed how the piece is balanced. Initially, we did a very soft, very gray sky up here to balance the more gray and subtle bottom that we had with the larger wave. But now that we've changed that, we can now afford a lot of additional detail and light up here. So that's just something to consider when you're working on your painting, when you're working with a reference photo and you decide later on in the painting to change something larger, because it's probably going to change the balance of that piece and it's going to alter the amount of detail, light, and everything else that you can incorporate in other areas. So this is actually rather exciting. It means we just get to continue building and improving on the painting. But with that said, we are getting quite far into the painting, and if you've made it this far, congratulations. I think that really shows a lot of dedication and eagerness to learn, and you should honestly be proud of yourself. So, as per usual, coming up with a word for you to type in the comments if you've made it this far as a little point of honor. You know, we'll all know that we made it that far. And the word for today is going to be splash. You can work it into a sentence. You can just put splash with an exclamation point as the comment itself, but just go to the comments, leave a comment with the word splash. That way I know you made it this far and you're one of those people who really does care about the process. With that said though, we are now going to hop right back into the sky and make some changes. Now I'm actually going to start redoing the sky here in a fairly interesting way. And that is by beginning with this relatively rough layer of titanium white, and I just applied this to the sky so that I didn't see the impressions of the initial clouds and all of those movements, because generally if you're going in to redo something and you can see all of the details from before, you'll probably start working off them and be heavily inspired to the point of perhaps not really doing anything new. So, to continue staying creative and doing something different, we just put that very rough layer. It can be very smooth, it can be very opaque if you want it to be, but just make sure that it's fully dry as you move to this next part. And for this next part, I'm going to take the 1-inch flat-headed brush, I'm going to take Cerulean blue, Mars black, a little bit of our red, and some titanium white. This will mix up a fairly dark grayish blue. There we go. I have a color up there that I do like quite a bit, and I'm going to match to it initially. See that it just needs to be a bit darker. Maybe a hint more red. And there we go. So now that I have the pigment that I want, I'm going to start working my way over to the other side. I know that initially I noted that I wanted it to be brighter, but once I added the white here, I realized that, you know what? The wave will actually pop a lot better if we go with a slightly darker sky. So, starting here, you can see I'm using quite a bit of pigment, going over it softly to smooth everything out. And we'll just move it slightly past that halfway mark. This also goes to show that you really can continuously edit a painting. I'm now going to make some purple, so more red than blue, titanium white, and some Mars black. We'll start with the darker purple. Perfect. Start by applying that over here on the left-hand side. Really like this. Works well with the blue that we just mixed. And I'm not going to do too much down here. I'll save that for later. In the process, you'll probably notice that you will be going over your pre-existing waves. That is okay. We can always go back and touch them up. They really are quite easy to work on top of other subjects. Now I'm taking that purple and I'm starting to work it over into the blue. You can see that this part jets out, creates an interesting motion for a cloud. We'll do another one right there. another half one here, and you want to make sure that if you like it and you want to do more of it, that the next time you do it, it isn't the exact same, because we still need diversity and we still need to change things to make them original and continuously captivating. But here we'll mix more of that nice dark purple, run it along the bottom of our horizon here, right around the waves, the splash, and I'll blend that back up. So we're thickening our layer, we're making sure that we don't see any of that white or previous sky through it. Right now it looks rather simple, but we are going to iterate. Here we'll make a cloud that's kind of out there. It's interesting. There we go. Now, I'm going to switch to the larger round-hooded brush. Grab some of our red, our white, mix those together with a small amount of the darker pigment that we were working with. Start at the bottom, connect this to our initial sky, and then we'll start working that up into our larger cloud. And we're going to paint the bottom of the cloud, the areas that are going to be receiving some of this warm pink light. So I'll mix up more of it. I'll say, okay, you know, the bottom over here, that's definitely going to be receiving that light as well. Let's make that nice and bright. It'll look really beautiful next to the blue. And now we're bringing that pink on into the other side of the painting, which is going to balance it well. Going to take more. We're going to say, okay, this is the bottom of another cloud. Let's make sure we get that. And then you can softly blend it up if you want, or you can keep it relatively sharp, and that'll give the cloud either the effect that it's building up gradually, or that it has a fairly definitive top and bottom. That's entirely up to you. Depends if you want a sharper or softer aesthetic. Right now, I'm leaning towards sharp, just because we have so many sharp lines in the bottom of the piece. Say, okay, you know what, this needs a bottom. We'll have another cloud in here, another one right there, and now I'm really trying to diversify and change things. Saying, okay, you know what, I might not see the definitive lines of these other possible clouds, but I'm going to paint them in as if I do. Do one right there. I am going over the top edges of each stroke, just with a back and forth motion. It's going to give it a softer look, but it's not going to make it soft to the point where it looks like it's gradually moving upwards. Getting a very dramatic sky right now. Then we'll do some smaller clouds intermixed in there. So you can see that these marks are significantly smaller. Occasionally they'll connect. We connected this one and this one. Do another up here. There we are. We'll also create some other clouds out here. First with the darker pigment. Then we'll head back to our palette. Grab that lighter pigment, head underneath, and just add more of that detail. You can also go over previously applied pigments if you want them to stand out slightly more, and just refine as we do everything else. Here I'm doing a little wash with red, just brightening up the cloud as a whole a tiny bit. Like that. But as you can see, this final sky here, it's just a series of, for the most part, horizontal strokes which aren't clean or sharp, showing the bottom of these clouds and where they're illuminated by the light down here. And then I'm going to soften that transition and make that nice and pretty. I'm going to go ahead, continue playing with this for another probably half an hour, and then we'll finish it off together. So it's actually about an hour later, and as you can see, the sky is now complete. It took significantly longer than I expected it to, but I actually learned a lot through the process. And one of the larger lessons I took away from it was, initially we started with these very broad strokes, we connected things, and that was great because it laid a foundation for the movement and the balance in the sky. But I found it really started to come together when I started breaking those up. When I took that blue from the sky and interjected it right in between some of our clouds like that. I used the same round-headed pointed brush for that, and I got a little bit of a blend down sometimes, but I tried to keep that hard edge at the bottom of each cloud relatively sharp. And breaking it up like this, it just made it feel so much more diverse and detailed. I also tried to really diversify my shape and size. And this cloud right here, this was a real turning point. You can see that there's a bit of a highlight that moves up vertically. For the most part, this was all very horizontal, right? These are long strips of cloud. And this one was the first one where I was like, you know what, we'll move upwards. And this had a lot of dimension. It really feels like the cloud's moving that way. It has more of a bottom that's catching light, and that was really interesting. It inspired this one, how this moves up right here, how this moves up right here, and it just made a really big difference in the painting. So when you're working on your sky, just continue to paint with smaller brushes, make your applications more detailed, make your clouds smaller, but do more of them, and occasionally work vertically with those highlights. I also have all of these little taps of highlight out here, and I feel like it just worked really, really beautifully. So at this point, I'm incredibly happy with that sky there. I've probably been working on this painting for, I don't know, maybe 10 hours now, but I feel like it's really paying off and I'm excited. With that said, something that occurred that I was aware would occur was a separation between the bottom half of the painting and the top half of the painting. So now you can see that the sky is slightly layered on top of the wave and the splashing effect. This is something you generally want to avoid. This is why we generally paint background to foreground, so that you're always layering your foreground and your new subjects on top of your previous ones, retaining detail and not worrying about that. But when you want to go back and repaint a sky, there really isn't another way around it. So with that, I'm actually going to continue painting my splashing effect and my wave now back over top of this. I'm going to grab that 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, going to peel back those bristles. We're going to make a very, very bright pinkish purple. So the smallest hint of red, smallest hint of blue, quite a bit of titanium white. Remember, we want to start with not the brightest pigment for our splashing. We want to build it up over time. So I'm going back along those edges because now we do have some hard edges. And we're going to try to integrate some of these taps in the splash. That way we have cohesive colors. I'm rotating my brush in the air, and this is actually good because, again, it reinstills all of these techniques and ideas. We didn't just do it once, we're doing it a number of times, and that way, you know, when we go to do another wave with another big splash in the future, we'll remember. But here you can see I'm working along that edge, and I'm trying to get rid of it as best I can. I'm now going to take more titanium white, work that into my mixture, and remember, it's not ideal to mix with this brush, but I'm pretty confident at this point that we'll get a good blend. But if you find that you're not getting those sharp, really beautiful applications, mix with your other brushes. Keep this one just for grabbing the paint and tapping it on. As you find you get more used to acrylic painting and these processes, you will be able to cheat a little bit like this and do the mixes, but it's not something I'd recommend doing early on. And you know, if you really love a piece and you don't want to risk hindering it, then I would simply just always mix with the other brush. But here you can see we're expanding up over those clouds. It's starting to feel really natural again. I'm letting it become lesser and lesser the farther we move out. Going over some of those edges, and then I'll create a slight mist effect, blowing back like that. There we go. Looking really nice. So from there, I'm going to switch to the larger round pointed brush. Again, it's about 1/4 inch. Going to grab some titanium white, a little bit of blue. I'm actually mixing this in with that pinkish gray mixture just because it was so nice. I think it'll work really well for this. I'm just making it a bit more gray, adding in a hint of blue. Going to make our brush quite wet. Come back into the top here. Remember, you want the majority of it on the top, not on the edge. That was a mistake. So I'm just going to take all of the paint off my brush, go in with a wet brush, and peel that off. Finger painting, still an incredible resource. I feel like I probably know that in every episode, but it's so true. Just like I also try to note in every episode how grateful I am to the patrons. Thank you again. The painting is coming to a conclusion. I am incredibly proud of it. I think this might be one of our most beautiful yet, and you know, just like all of the others, it only happens because of you. So on behalf of myself and everybody else who watches these lessons, I would like to say a big thank you. You do a lot for us. Here I'm mixing a bit more of a grayish blue. Just filling in the top. Just getting slightly more detail. I do see some pink showing through, and it's making this look almost like there isn't water right there. So I'm just fixing that really easily, really quickly. Might wash out the front end right there slightly. And this is also nice because it simplifies the values up here, brings the eye back down where we want them. I like that a lot. I really like that. Wow. So I took a couple steps back, I looked at the painting, I thought about it, I evaluated all of the different subjects and areas, and the conclusion I came to was that I am finished. We are done our painting, and this is honestly such an incredible feeling because this painting to me, it wasn't easy. There were different things that I needed to learn along the way. There were different techniques I tried. We redid a number of the different larger subjects. And I think that's why it feels so gratifying to get to this point and to have something that I really, really love. If you feel like a painting you're working on, maybe it's not this one, but really any painting is difficult or a challenge, or you have to redo this or that, honestly, keep working through it. Keep finding ways to improve, try different things, because at the end, when you do succeed, when you do make that painting the way you want it to look, you'll feel incredible. And this, again, I think that it's one of the more beautiful pieces we've created together. It's one of the more detailed pieces, and it's also one of the pieces that just makes me feel incredibly proud to look at and to see completed. So with that, thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope you learned a lot about painting foam, about painting splashing effects, clouds, how the water actually moves. I feel like we covered quite a bit in this lesson. So anyways, before we end this, I would like to say a big thank you yet again to our patrons for supporting the channel, for making this happen. Remember, if you do support the channel up over on Patreon, you can get the reference photo, which I used quite a bit in the beginning of this lesson to match those colors and make sure that the wave was just right, because remember, the colors in that wave are really the foundation of that painting. Also, you can now get both traceables. Generally, I only do a single traceable, but we do have two versions of this painting, this one and the one with the larger wave in the foreground. It does take a little bit more time and work to draw both out, but I can do so because of you and your support. So really big thank you to you for that, for, allowing me to continue making more detailed lessons, trying out more risky things in the lessons, and doing extra things like the additional traceables. So really, really thank you. Remember, if you'd like to support the channel up over on Patreon and get all of that, you can do so. There's a link in the description. You can also get the ebooks, access to our exclusive Facebook group, personalized art critiques, and all of that good stuff. But anyways, this was a pleasure. I had a really fun time with this seascape. It initially won the poll that I put up over on Patreon, but since I've put that up, I believe 3 other paintings have passed it. So I will continue to paint the ones that you vote for, that you decided on, and I will see you next week with a brand new painting lesson, provided, of course, you subscribe, but more importantly, hit the bell button. That way you're notified when the new lessons come out. This was a real pleasure. I really look forward to our next lesson together, and as per usual, whether you're supporting the channel on Patreon or not, thank you for just being here, for being a part of the community, for leaving comments, sharing the videos, all of it. It means a lot, and I love having you here. So thank you so much. Above all, as always, stay creative.